people.
There we go, some analysis of what the Chancellor did say, but what should George Osborne have put in the budget? Joining me now to discuss that are Kate Andrews from the Adam Smith Institute and Marcus Roberts, the Deputy General Secretary of the Fabian Society. Thank you both for joining us. Before we get started, though, a reminder that you can join in the debate as well. You can tweet us at Sky News, include the hashtag Sky Debate as well. You can text us on 84501 or email us news@sky.com. Let us know what you think, or if there are any points you want to put to our guests here this morning. We'll read out some of your comments as we go along. I'll come to you first, Kate. What were the big omissions from the budget yesterday, in your opinion?
Well, what really came across yesterday in the budget was how well the economy is doing. Britain is getting back on track. Growth is finally up. Unemployment is at its lowest rate that it's been in the past 6 years, and employment is at the highest rate it's been since the ONS has started tracking those figures. So the economy is back up, and the Chancellor does have a bit more money to play around with. The question is, what should he be doing with it? And I think most people can agree that back in 2012, austerity really stopped. There have still been some cuts to the budget, but what the Chancellor proposed and what he laid out for his 5 years in office have really taken a step back since then. We need to continue to cut this deficit. It's still over $100 billion a year. That is money that's being kicked down the road. That's going to be on us. It's going to be on our kids. People down the road are going to have to be paying that back in tax at some point. And I didn't really appreciate his giveaways to the middle class. As much as I like people being taken out of national insurance, as much as I like the personal allowance threshold being risen, I think that there should be more focus on the working class, the poor, the people who need those giveaways the most.
OK, Marcus, I'll come to you. The budget very much focusing on this burgeoning economy. Sunny days are back, according to George Osborne. But what was missing from the budget for you?
Well, it was very strange for me listening to the budget yesterday, because the Chancellor spoke a lot about national statistics now and in the future, but very little about the real-life experience to so many Britons across this country. And that's an experience that's shaped increasingly by low pay, by rising use of food banks, and by closures to Sure Start centres and NHS walk-in centres. The Chancellor went out of his way to not talk about the NHS and social security provision in this budget, and I think that's because beneath the national statistics, which he says prove the sunshine has returned, the real experience of voters heading to the polls in just 48 days' time is very different from that.
Yeah, I mean, Kate, did that ring true for you and from what people you've spoken to have said about the budget? I mean, the TUC Secretary-General said the Chancellor's Britain, where happy people skip to their secure jobs to celebrate their rising living standards, is not one many people will actually realise watching at home.
Not necessarily. I think the reason that the Chancellor didn't talk about the NHS is because it's been spoken about so often, and all of the parties have made huge pledges to fund the NHS. It's been completely ring-fenced. This is a non-issue for the parties at the moment. They're all and it's a stale talking point because they're all promising to throw lots and lots of money at the situation, frankly, money they don't have. But most people who are on zero-hours contracts are very happy to be there. Over 70% of people say that they want to be on zero-hours contracts because they like the flexibility. Employment is at an all-time high. The reality is that more people have jobs in the UK now, and the average income of a person has also skyrocketed since the Chancellor took office. So I think the case is that in real times, no, things aren't perfect, and the people who are really struggling are the people at the bottom. I would like to see the Chancellor put more of an effort into raising the personal allowance even higher and to taking poor people out of national insurance altogether.
He didn't talk about the NHS, and that was something, Marcus, that a lot of people picked up on. And as Casey was pointing out there, perhaps the NHS and education has been spoken about so much, he didn't feel there was any place for it in the budget speech. But he did point out that there are going to be more cuts, harsher cuts ahead, in fact, double the cuts seen in any year across the current Parliament. But he doesn't say where those cuts will come from. The NHS is ring-fenced, as is education. So where are those cuts going to come from, in your opinion?
That's exactly right. And when the Office of Budget Responsibility said yesterday that the cuts planned for 2016 and 17 and beyond were deeper and greater than anything yet experienced in this Parliament, and yet there's still far too little information about how those cuts will fall and where they'll come from, I think we all have good cause to worry. And that's why I think Ed Miliband was right to say that there could be a real risk that under a next-term Tory government there could be further cuts to the NHS. That means the closure of further NHS walk-in centres, fewer nurses, fewer doctors, and a bigger NHS crisis. And I think the idea that the Chancellor thought that the NHS had been talked enough about is actually quite insulting to the British voter, because at this time, all of the polls show that the NHS is the #1 concern of the British public. It's time that the Chancellor spoke properly about his plans for the NHS in the future, so that he could reassure the public that the NHS if he were re-elected.
Kate, from what Marcus is saying there, it sounds like the NHS may not be safe in the future under a potential Tory government. I mean, is that what you think? Do you think nothing's safe at the moment when it comes to these cuts? They're quite dramatic. The OBR saying that it's a roller coaster profile of cuts and spendings in the next few years.
I don't think that the NHS is going to be safe under any political party at the moment. The money isn't there. And this is the problem that we've been facing for decades that's only finally being addressed now. Frankly, without radical reform to education, to healthcare, to welfare, we are going to see these public services suffer. It doesn't matter if it's the Conservatives or Labour. A lot of false promises are being made across the board. I can't speak to whether or not George Osborne is making false promises or whether Ed Miliband is specifically, but I can say that all of these services are at risk if we don't have fundamental reform. And that's what we need to be focused on. And we only need to look at our counterparts across Europe. We don't even need to go as extreme as Greece. We can just look at France to see what happens when you continue to pledge money but don't make the radical reforms needed. Unemployment is at over 10%. These public services are really at risk. And until politicians start having those honest conversations, not just the Conservatives, not just Labour, but the whole public needs to start talking about the real radical reforms that have to happen. And I want to know from Marcus, where would you get the money from the NHS? Because we know that taxing people over 35% doesn't tend to be very effective. You tend to lose money when you start doing that. So where do you see these cuts coming, or where do you see this money coming from if you want to avoid these cuts to the big services?
Well, Marcus, I'll let you reply. Where is this money going to come from?
Well, I don't think it's just about the NHS, and I think that there's far more in terms of tax avoidance and tax evasion that we can clamp down on beyond the $5 billion that is supposedly mooted later this morning by Danny Alexander, because it's not just about the NHS, it's also about our armed forces. And at a time when we're facing increased Russian aggression in terms of Russian overflights into British airspace and pressure on our NATO members in the Baltics, I find it the Chancellor stood up yesterday, delivered a budget and did not commit the British government to the minimum of 2% of GDP in NATO defence spending. The defence of the realm is the first duty of government, and this Chancellor is facing a growing call of opposition from his own backbenches as well as senior military figures to commit Britain to that all-important 2% NATO defence spending pledge. And until he does so, he's not getting serious about defence. I just think it's remarkable that we went through an entire budget yesterday and didn't talk about the defence of the realm.
But, Kate, it's fair to say that none of the parties are being drawn on defence, aren't they? It's not traditionally a priority in the run-up to a general election.
No, especially when the country feels safe, which I actually think it does at the moment. So that's not going to be a priority. And I think that what we're really asking here is, what does the public value? And we have polls and we have a good sense of what the public values, but it's really going to come out on election day. What does the public value? Do they value the economy? Are they happy about their jobs? Or do they feel that increase in wages in their pocket? Or are they worried about their public services? That's the real question. But the reality is that at some point, if to tackle this £100 billion deficit year on year, we are going to have to make some serious reforms. And while the Conservatives, in my opinion, haven't gone far enough to make those reforms and are continuing to kick the can down the road, Labour isn't addressing it at all, and most of the parties aren't addressing it at all. It's not politically popular to do so, but it's the conversation that needs to happen.
OK, well, we've got the Lib Dems giving their version of the budget coming up at 11:30. It'll be interesting to see what they've got in there for us. Marcus and Kate, thank you very much indeed. It's back over to Colin.
Just some news coming in from the Foreign Office. They're unable to confirm at this stage reports coming out of Tunisia in connection with the terror attack yesterday, which killed at least 21 people. There have been reports that some Britons were involved, perhaps 2 people involved. Well, a British